Hello and welcome to today's webinar, the 9 key components of an effective physician integration strategy. This is being delivered as part of Healthcare Strategy Group's 2015 webinar series. Today we'll be discussing exactly what the title says, the 9 key components to an effective physician integration strategy. Healthcare Strategy Group, our firm is really focused on helping hospitals develop, implement, and manage their physician integration strategy. And we see a number of our clients with various different definitions and different kind of components that make up what they call physician integration strategy. And given the level of education we've been doing with our clients on this topic, we thought it'd be helpful to have a webinar that just kind of holistically captures our high-level thoughts about exactly what hospitals today need to do to really create a strategy that's going to serve their organization well and really tie their physician actions to the overall organizational strategy. My name is Travis Ansel. I'm the Senior Manager of Strategic Services with Healthcare Strategy Groups. For the last 10 years, I've been helping hospitals delve deeply into this very topic, facilitating planning engagements and advising clients on exactly this topic. What is our physician integration strategy? How do we implement it? How do we execute it? Our philosophy as a firm, as I mentioned, is really that the development, refinement, and execution of a comprehensive physician integration strategy is the most critical thing. And if we don't have that in place as an organization, all of our various interactions and relationships with physicians kind of become in question. Do they really support the organization's strategic need? Are we going to have the resources to make those physicians successful? Are we going to have the resources to implement our overall strategy effectively? And do we have the competencies to make managing those physician relationships something that make that a successful part of our business, or are we just going to create more problems by developing more relationships with physicians? The challenges that we see, there's really 3. Well, take that back. There are a number of challenges, but we like to think of them in terms of 3 buckets when you don't have a comprehensive physician integration strategy in place. So these are the hospitals that they have either something they call a strategy, or we just kind of go day to day. We deal with our physician relationships on a day-to-day basis with no long-term view, or decisions aren't made in the context of a strategy. Things of that nature. So the first challenge is if we don't have a plan in place that defines what success is going to look like and what we need to do, we're never going to get our administrative team, or the people who are responsible for making decisions and executing our physician strategy, they're never going to be on the same page. And then they're never going to know exactly whether or not the deals that they're creating are supporting the organization, or whether they're either not going to be effective in supporting the organization or even detrimental to the organization. The second thing we see is when we don't have a plan, we can't be proactive. And what we see a lot of hospitals today being is reactive. So either when physicians come to the door, a physician group comes to the door and say, what we really need is more money for call, what we really need is a co-management deal to funnel some money to us, or what we want is to be employed. We don't have the plan that says, yes, you are strategically important to us, yes, we need to create further alignment with your group, or no, it's great that you're a part of our medical community, but we're not really in a position to do what you're wanting us to do because that doesn't make sense for us strategically. And then the same thing happens from a competitive level. So as our competitors start executing their strategy and putting pressure on us to respond, we don't have the framework in place to effectively make decisions about how to respond to competitor activity, and we certainly can't pressure our competitors because we're not being proactive. The third piece we see is the ability to manage. So if we don't know how we're going to grow, and this particular dynamic really impacts hospitals with their employed physician networks. If we can't anticipate how much we're going to grow in the future, we're never going to be able to proactively build the infrastructure to support a group of that size. And what you see is hospitals growing physician networks from, maybe when you started employing doctors, you had, just 10 or 20 that had been employed over time for various reasons, and then we decided to make employment a thing. So we went from 20 to 100, in the course of 3 years, and we still have the infrastructure to manage a group of 20 or 30 doctors because we got so caught up in the growth that we never really built out our management capability. So we see that becoming an issue. And then we also see if we don't have the strategy in place that kind of lays out the framework for how we're going to align with physicians, what we see is a bunch of different administrative team members creating different types of deals with physicians. We'll see different types of employment agreements. We'll see different types of co-management agreements. We'll see some physicians align through call pay, some through medical directorships. And what you get is just this mass of different types of alignment arrangements, which are really hard to even administer, let alone to say that the totality of those agreements is providing a net benefit to the organization or measuring what that net benefit is. When we talk about defining a comprehensive physician integration strategy, we thought it'd be helpful to spend today's webinar just really talking about what are the components of that strategy, what are the questions we have to ask in each piece, and how do all these things fit together so that your plan not only do you have a plan, but you have everything you need in place to execute that plan. So when we think about comprehensive physician integration strategy, it kind of breaks down in 3 major buckets. So one, we have to ask ourselves the big strategic questions. One, where are we trying to grow to as an organization? So as we look at our markets geographically, what type of market penetration are we looking to have, down to the zip code level for all the areas that we want to serve? Are the markets we've historically served the markets we want to serve going forward, or are there other markets that we should try to have a larger presence in? Have we aggregated enough physicians in areas over time, either by chance or by choice, to where we need to think about other things like a large outpatient center or even another small hospital, things of that nature, because that has real implications for what types of physicians we need to add or create relationships with, what types of capabilities we need. The second big strategic question we have to ask is what do we want to do on a service line basis? What are our priorities? How does that impact which physicians we need to have relationships with in order to secure our access to resources in that service line, or whether we need to recruit physicians who have, if we want to make a big push in orthopedics, do we have the sub-specialty ortho players to really make that something that we can hang our hat on as an organization versus a service line that we may not, we may operate it because it's part of our mission, but doesn't necessarily have a lot of strategic value to us, and as such, the physician relationship decisions become a little different. And then the third piece we have to ask, which is it's becoming a bit of a different question as it relates to what physicians and what physician relationships do we need, is what's our accountable care strategy? Where are we going in terms of accountable care? Where do we see value-based reimbursement going in our market? In turn, how does that impact the level of population management capabilities that we need? Does that require a different provider mix than we already have? Are our relationships with payers and self-insured employers going to create different demands on primary care access or primary care capabilities that we haven't historically had? So those, in the strategy development bucket, those are the big questions we have to ask before we can even start thinking about what physician relationships do we need and how do we facilitate those physician relationships. Once we've answered those, the next piece of the physician integration strategy becomes what resources and relationships do we need? And it says physician here. Provider is probably a more accurate term going forward given the level of advanced practitioner penetration we're seeing in a number of markets, but we'll use physician here. What do we need from a manpower alignment and capability standpoint to really execute our strategy? We are always big advocates of, we love bringing in new physicians. We love when organizations bring in new physician recruits, but we are always advocates of, can we meet our strategic need with the physicians that exist in the market before we go out and try to recruit any physicians. So the first question we ask ourselves is, based upon our geographic growth strategy, our service line strategy, and our accountable care strategy, can we generate what we need from the existing physicians in the market through evolving our alignment strategy? So that's what falls under the physician alignment needs bucket, and that's really, we recommend taking a look at every physician in your market, understanding to what level they're aligned with your organization or another, and then laying that against your strategic needs and assessing, really, do we have effective alignment with those physicians, or do we need to change that alignment, and would that address our strategic needs? For areas where we can address our strategic needs through alignment, we start thinking about recruitment. So that's where, you want to take a look at, do we have, what specialties in our market have physician need or show physician need? Do we have the right provider mix? Going back to the accountable care question, do we have the adequate amount of primary care to support our employed network of specialists, or are we still reliant on an independent primary care base that may or may not shift its referral patterns or change its allegiances at a whim? And then do we have our arms around what our succession planning issues are, and do we have new physicians that are being brought in to help us resolve those succession issues before we run into a situation where we're losing physicians and then by proxy losing patients? And then the last physician resource we need to think about, a little bit different than just the raw bodies and relationships, is the physician leadership capabilities, because so much of where hospital strategy is going forward is really around the leadership question. Do we have the right clinical leadership? Do we have someone that can really help, or do we have not just someone, but the level of people in those clinical leadership roles that can help bridge the hospital administration and physician relationship? Do we have the right program in place for identifying and helping mentor and develop those leaders? That sort of question. And then finally, so working through this, what we have is we've identified what our strategic needs are. We've identified what physicians we need to execute that strategy. The third question, which we don't see a whole lot of hospitals ask, or we don't see them ask as part of putting together a plan, but then they quickly figure out they need to get their arms around, is how do we ensure the strategy is successful, and what do we need to do to build the capabilities to make sure the physicians we create relationships with are successful, and then by proxy that we're able to execute our strategy. So the first thing we like to see our clients get their arms around is, do we simply have the space for all the physicians we're talking about growing with, or the relationships we're talking about creating, or the geographic penetration we're talking about creating? Do we have the facilities and the spaces that we need that are strategically appropriate for our strategy, or is that something that that we need to get our arms around now because new construction, because acquiring new space generally has a pretty long lead time, and we don't want to have a bunch of physicians sitting around waiting to see patients and not having a space that's appropriate to put them in. The second big question we ask is, do we have the network management capabilities to operate? And this is really focused on the employed network. Do we have the capabilities to run an effective employed physician network? Is employing physicians a competency of ours in operating those practices? Is that a competency, or is that something that we're just kind of getting by with? And when we look at physician network management, we tend to take a broader view. We see a lot of clients still focusing on how big is my group, how much revenue does it generate for the hospital, how much am I losing in the practices, and measuring their group by those three things. We tend to think those three things are almost, those aren't results, those are symptoms of either a well-run or a poorly run group. And we look at a broader picture that includes, do we have the right infrastructure for managing the group against best practices? Is our operations in line? Is our revenue cycle in line? Do we have a compensation model that aligns the providers with the strategic goals of the hospital? Do we have the right leadership in place, both from an administrative and clinical perspective? Do we have a compelling brand and a compelling message to offer to the market about what that group is and how it's aligned with the hospital? And then does it have the right culture so that the physicians are supportive of one another in the hospital? And then finally, the last thing that we always like to see hospitals looking at, because it really goes to can we execute the strategy, is, do we have the physician recruitment resources we need internally? Because that's one of the things we see hospitals struggle with, is we get these ambitious plans of we need to add X providers in these markets and these specialties, and then realizing their bandwidth on the recruitment side is very small, or they're not willing to deal with the fees associated to a recruiter. And then the same thing on the business development function, having an effective physician liaison program and having an effective onboarding program, two things that can really help get new physicians up to speed quickly and make sure they're a benefit and not a liability to the organization. And then the last piece is marketing and PR, which hospital organizations tend to be good at marketing hospital capabilities and not necessarily physician capabilities, especially as it relates to employed physicians. So that's one of the things that we like to make sure we have a strategy for as part of an overall physician integration strategy, and make sure that the marketing function is supporting the execution of the overall strategy. In terms of the strategy development components, what you see on slide 8 is kind of a deeper dive. This talks about a lot of the questions we just talked about, but it's worth reviewing each of these key considerations in each category, because this really speaks to what it takes to get your arms around the strategy development component. The ones I would point out and re-emphasize on geographic growth strategy is the presence we've defined in each market we want to serve strategically appropriate, or is it just where we've always been? And then the same thing for a service line strategy. Are we prioritizing what's relevant going forward for our strategy, or are we playing around in the same sandbox where we've always played in because it's comfortable? And then the same thing on accountable care strategy. Not just where are we now, but where are we going in terms of accountable care, and what are the implications of that for our provider network? To take a deeper dive into the physician resource and relationship development components, in terms of physician alignment, again, the key question here is, do we have the relationships we need to strategically support the organization, not just do we have relationships? And that's a pretty fine line, but it's one that means an awful lot. So not just do we have an agreement, but do we have a strategically effective agreement? In terms of physician recruitment needs, again, to reemphasize what I would consider the main point, which is, do we have, what providers do we need to recruit because we can't create alignment, or we can't address our strategic need through alignment in our market? We usually see organizations kind of start the other way around. Can we recruit physicians, and then who else do we maybe want to align with? We tend to be in favor of having a plan that supports alignment first and recruitment second. And then on physician leadership, again, reemphasizing that we don't just need physician bodies to deliver clinical care, we also need clinical leadership capabilities, and making sure that that's part of our physician relationship development strategy as well. And then on the execution components, to reemphasize the main point on each, facility and space development, this needs to be done as part of your strategy as opposed to after your strategy. There's a long lead time on facility and space development, and that is a critical piece towards making especially newly recruited physicians successful. In terms of physician network management, our key point here is that it needs to be a core competency, and you need to take a holistic view in your organization of how your network's performing and not just measure it on the financials and on the group size. And then in terms of the supporting capabilities, again, these are things that aren't traditionally thought of when you think about necessarily about, we need to work with physicians better, but they're things that make physicians successful. So getting the right marketing strategy, the right business development strategy, and the right recruitment strategy and resources in place are what are really going to make you successful there. So in terms of, going back to this administrative challenges slide, We talked about, as we talked through this, I think it's clear that as we build a plan that has all of these components, objectives for the senior team really become clarified. So we know what strategy we're trying to execute, we know what physicians we're trying to recruit and what relationships we need with those physicians to be successful, and then we know how to make them successful. With a plan like this, our decision making no longer becomes reactive. We now have a proactive plan that we can send our people out to execute rather than waiting for physicians or competitors to drive our hand and make us do something. And then finally, if we have a proactive plan, that means we can proactively build our infrastructure, and we can proactively plan for how to structure agreements so that we can easily get our arms around the growth that we've created and manage it effectively. So with that, that wraps up today's webinar. I'd invite you to look at the thought leadership available on our website. We have fantastic newsletters, the Physician Strategy News. We have on-demand webinars like the one you're viewing today, a whole host of those. And then we also have, for anyone with specific physician network questions, I recommend our ebook, 67 Tips for a High-Performing Physician Network. We also have a new guide related to adding value to physician compensation, which I think is particularly good. And then we also have a number of other things like case studies and a recent study we published with HFMA on physician engagement and alignment. Again, if anyone has any questions after viewing this webinar, please contact me, Travis Ansel, at the contact information provided below. And a little more about our firm can be found at the end of this presentation. So with that, I thank you for your participation, and we look forward to seeing you on future webinars.